Hi, this is Bob Sorrentino from Italian Roots and Genealogy, and I'm here today with Anthony Riccio, who has authored several great books about Italian Americans and their stories. And what's really great about his books is that he's given a presentation of people in their own words. So thanks, Anthony. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you. Thank you. My pleasure. It's always a pleasure to do these kind of conversations. And the reason why is that these are vehicles of keeping our history very, very much alive. And that's not because I've written it, but because the nature of my books are stories that people told me that have been passed down from generations to generations and then end up in my books as actual oral history. So by doing these presentations, it's not so much about me, the author. It's about us, our roots, because the stories that make up my books are pure oral history. They're stories just like you said at the beginning of our conversation. Let's have a table conversation, and I like that because all the people I interviewed over the last, 40 years of writing books. I mean, interviewing. It was pretty much dinner table conversations. It wasn't a formal kind of thing where you asked really. I wasn't trying to prove a thesis here. I wasn't trying to write a dissertation with my work. I was just trying to capture the stories of working class, regular, common Italian Americans all over New England and get their story, because I realized that if we didn't get these stories, it was going to be lost. So by doing these kind of presentations now, we're keeping it alive. We're keeping history alive because that is our history, Bob. Our history mostly, I don't mean to offend any Italian Americans here, but most of our history, because at the turn of the century, most of our ancestors didn't have, I'm not going to say they weren't educated. They were educated in the ways of the world, but they didn't have a chance for formal education because of the social structure. So we're an oral culture, basically an oral culture. So what I did was I tapped into that by conducting hundreds and hundreds of oral histories in different places over the past 40 years, which make up my books. And these oral histories are very kind of like you and I talking right now at the dinner table on a Sunday afternoon. Very relaxed. I knew these people. It wasn't like I was walking in trying to get a scoop. And I think I got some very intimate details, very moving details in a very simple but eloquent way. And hopefully, like I said, we talked about this, maybe we can do a follow-up to this where we can let people listen to some of these oral histories. It's almost like your grandmother sitting down with you again. It doesn't really matter if they're from Boston or New Haven or from Connecticut. It's the same story.
And I think that's fabulous. And we all have our interesting stories. And as we were talking in the pre-interview, I was lucky enough to find out that my cousin had recorded my uncle in Barres, which I had never known for all of these years, and he finally translated. And it is a look into how he lived from the early 1900s until he came to America in 1950. So I want to certainly talk about the stories, but how about your Italian family?
My story begins with my grandmother. You can shoot it up on the screen now if you want, because that's where the story begins with me. I grew up in a typical Italian American neighborhood where grandparents lived downstairs, we lived upstairs, another set of grandparents lived next door. Across the street. Yeah, across the street it was a transplanted little Italian village. It really was. Across the street, I had two grown uncles with their wives and all kinds of cousins running around. They didn't venture too far either. And but the base of it, the source of all our culture were our grandparents. And I was always around my grandparents. And here I am, this, third generation Italian American kid growing up in the 50s in the age of Elvis and the atomic age. And if I ever wanted to go back to the 1700s or the 1800s, all I had to do was go downstairs to visit my grandparents, who spoke a different language, who revered the saints. And there were all these little altars on all the bureaus and the doilies, and and just their ways were just so different. And I was fascinated because I love especially my grandmother. That's the picture I want to show because she's the source of all my going back to Italy and my writing. I was so fascinated by her ways and her language. She spoke in a dialect. She had funny stories. She was from, she could have been from the 1200s. I mean, she was just that embodiment of our culture in so many different ways. So I used to say to her, and we kind of made up our own language because she spoke in dialect and I spoke English, American, and we kind of figured it out as we went along. So I learned from her, she learned from me, but we were very close. We were very close. And I'd say, Graham, why would you leave Italy and come here? And of course, this is, the universal question that I'm sure many of us asked our grandparents. Me being a young kid at the time, of course, I'm studying now high Italian culture in grammar school. I'm learning about Bernini and Michelangelo and Da Vinci. So I'm figuring, hey, this must be a great country. And so I go to my grandmother and I didn't understand the whole history of the North and the South and the reunification and the peasantry and the social structure. And I said, so Grandma, why did you leave? And she just used to say to me, because I don't like. Because I don't like. And that was the end of the discussion. And she didn't realize it, but at the time she was fueling, all my imagination and I couldn't wait. I could not wait till the time I got old enough. I wanted to go back to Italy and find out where she came from.
Oh, so what town did she? Where is she from?
She, like my grandparents on both sides, came from these little hamlets that when I go to Italy, I tell people the names and they scratch their heads because they've never heard of it. My grandmother came up from a little village. The biggest village was Caiazzo, which is near Capua. Caiazzo, and the next town down was my grandmother's town, was the town of Alvignano. And it's just a little, look, we, especially the people from the Campania region and pretty much the South, but we all descended from one tribe. We were all from the Samnites. Mm-hmm. The Samnites. They were a roughly organized group of peasants and farmers that didn't have big cities, but they had these pastoral villages where they were organized by these cooperatives. They had these farming villages, and that was pretty much the same until almost like the 1950s and 60s. If you go back to these little villages, and especially the Campania region, you find there's still really rural places, and you get that taste, that feeling that somehow this was ancient. These rolling hills and these farmlands, go back hundreds, if not thousands of years. And that's where most of us, not all, because some of us, come from cities, but I'd say 70, 80%, at least of the people in Connecticut and, that area. And boy, they all descended from that peasant culture, from these little rural villages, from the same kind of place my grandparents came from, these little hamlets. And that's what they were fleeing at the turn of the century, Bob. There was no future there. It was the end of the line.
Yeah, and now my mom's parents came because my grandfather had fought in the war in Libya, I think around 1910 or 1911.
Yeah, the
right?
Italo-Turkish War. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And the right after, I guess, World War I started, my grandmother didn't want him going back to the army. By that time, she had a couple of kids.
Yeah, yeah.
And so they came to America. And I've heard two stories, but I think more likely because they left my uncle behind, I think they originally, like a lot of people did, and I didn't know this until recently, planned on going back. But then they started having more children, and I guess my grandfather had work and everything like that, mm-hmm. and so they stayed, and again, they didn't have the money to go back and forth, or somebody come over and pick him up and bring him back or anything like that. So. Yeah. And I had mentioned this in the pre-interview that he actually stayed there until he was in his 30s and had his whole family. And he didn't come until around first to Canada in 1950 and then, to America in like 54 or 55 or something like that.
Interesting. Yeah. We all have that, all of us especially us third generation, second, third generation, we all have that story, and there's so many variations of it. It's fascinating. It's fascinating. And I got to just, now that you say all this, I just realized that, in some of my books, I was fortunate enough to capture firsthand stories of the trip, of being on the ships.
Yeah.
People who actually came over and
Right.
recalled the whole experience firsthand. Fascinating stuff. They talked about, the sicknesses and not being able to eat for 8 days. And, there's one striking image in one of the books, the one on the women, that the book on the women that I wrote, is that they actually, just imagine this for a minute, Bob. You're coming over, especially, mostly the women came after the men.
Right.
The men would call for the women. And the women now who were left in these little villages, like my grandmother, think of it for a second, how brave they were. A lot of these women had no worldly knowledge outside the walls of their city. They weren't allowed to, because of the patriarchal system they lived in. They didn't know the ways of the world. They only spoke their dialect. Many of them didn't read. Now they get a letter from home, from the United States, from their husband, because that's how they planned it. A lot of the women planned these, that you go to America, make enough money, then you send for us. So now think of it for a minute. You get a letter now in the mail, Serafina, pack up all the kids, sell the cows, get rid of the furniture, go down to Naples and get on the next ship or to Genoa and come to America. Wow, think of it. Women who never left their villages now pack up their kids, sell their stuff, bid farewell to their parents, maybe never going to see them again. And they depart for this unknown world. It could have been, this new unexplored world that they just stepped into on their way to find their husbands back to this country they called America, with 2 or 3 kids in tow. I've got some stories about that. Could you imagine, though, when some of these kids got sick on board and died, mothers stood watching their kids being buried at sea. They were buried at sea. Just an amazing story that we might have lost had I, didn't capture this one story of a woman who told me, watching her son being thrown over the side of the bow, buried at sea. But this is part of our story. You see that these are the nuances that luckily I was able to save in my work.
Yeah, and that's really incredible stuff. So, what possessed you to start this in the first place? I mean, because this was a huge effort, especially back when you started.
It was unwitting. I mean, I wasn't. I wasn't. I didn't come from a group. Our family, we were not writers. We were not intellectuals. We were just working class people. And I remember I'll tell you a funny story. We're sitting at the Easter table one time, and I realized that it was time for me to write my first book. I had all these oral history stories, and I said, darn it, if I don't write this book, if I don't publish these oral histories, they're going to get lost. So I got the nerve at the Easter table. There's like 15 of us sitting around at the table. And I got to make this announcement, So we're sitting around the table, my mother, my father, the aunts, uncles, the cousins. And I said, excuse me, I just want to tell everybody something. And of course, everybody, looked at me like I'd never done that before. And they just kind of stopped for a minute and they looked at me. And I said, Mom, Dad, I'm gonna write a book about the North End. And so my father looks at my mother. My mother looks at my father. My father looks at me. He goes, oh, okay, let's eat. It wasn't, great. What possessed me? Okay. Well, I was fortunate enough that when I finished college, I had been to Italy 2 times on study programs. I went to Providence College and I went on a summer program, a study program, and then I went back and found my grandmother's village and got to know my cousins and my aunts and uncles, and that changed my whole life's trajectory. When I graduated from Providence College, I had been to Italy twice. I had been to that little village. I had photographed it, and I just got the feel for where my grandmother came from, and I wanted more. I just wanted to go back to Italy. I was 21 years old. Luckily, I got a fellowship from Syracuse University to get my master's degree in Florence. And I followed with I went to Florence the next out of college and graduate school. And spent my whole year, studying art in Florence, but then I would photograph, and I spent my whole summer photographing Southern Italy in 1974, 75. So you can imagine the conditions and the photographs, which became my book, From Italy to the North End. But that's another story. What possessed me to do all this? Okay. So I come back to America, and I got my master's in art history, and I've been rubbing elbows with some of the greatest art historians. I'm studying, everything's in Italian. All my professors are Italian professors. I come back to New Haven in the 70s. There's no jobs. I'm lost. My girlfriend in Boston, who's now my wife, sent me a note. She said, Anthony, there's a notice I just saw in the newspaper, the Boston Globe. It's 4 sentences. I think you might be interested in this. So it said, work in America's oldest anti-poverty agency, work in a neighborhood setting, must speak Italian. I said, that's it. Okay, so I applied for the job. I got the job. What job do I get? I end up in the north end of Boston, which is a very closely knit, closed off place. And I get a job, which was a million to one odds that I'm going to, not only, I don't know if you know Boston, but it's very, very, it's not even provincial. It's so territorial. Every corner is owned by somebody, at least in those days. Never mind the streets. It was still street corner society in those days. Anyway, so I get a job at this anti-poverty agency called Action for Boston Community Development. And my job was to run the Senior Citizen Center, which was a drop-in center for elders in the North End who are now, they're all on fixed incomes. They're still living in these cold water flats that go back to the 40s and 30s. They're still speaking in their old dialects, okay? And they're poor. Basically, they're just living on Social Security. And they're living in these freezing cold water. Anyway, so I open up this drop-in center. This is federally funded in this neighborhood center, and I become the senior citizen coordinator. So what happens? Because I understood the Southern code of behavior, because I understood what it meant to be old when I was very young, because of my experiences with my grandparents, because I was taught that old, I don't want to sound corny, you know how it is, but that old world respect, that way of behaving and acting towards your elders, it was ground into me from a year. So I knew how to act with these folks, and I spoke the language, and I understood the dialect, because no one spoke really Italian. They were all talking Sicilian. They were talking Calabrese. They were talking dialects of, it was like a cosmopolitan. So it was like Southern Italy in the north end of Boston. What happens? They start telling me their stories. As they're coming into the drop-in center, I got programs. I got, legal services. We have soup on, I got a woman cooking, making soup for them on Wednesdays. We have all kinds of little programs. Now the word goes out, because it's just you're talking 1977 now, 78. There's no, the information highway are the streets and the corners. Everybody's talking with each other. There's no internet. So the word goes out. You got trouble? You got trouble with your landlord? Your pipes don't work. You need go see Antonio. Gila parla italiana. Non ti preoccupare. Vai a vedere Antonio. Everybody go see Anthony. No problem. He'll help you. So now there's like a line in the place. Because why? I don't know. Because my parents just taught me to be compassionate, to be nice to people, to listen. I learned how to listen at a very young age because that's the culture we grew up in. We learned how to listen as kids, not to respond. Think about this for a second, Bob. The nature of our oral history culture. I don't know about this is how you listened to learn, not to respond.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, listen. I know what you mean. Yeah.
So I began listening to these folks. Of course, they're talking to me in their dialect. I'm starting to listen to these. So I decided, look, I've got to start recording all this stuff. This is too precious. And I started this neighborhood program, this neighborhood thing, where I got a cassette tape recorder, and I'm walking around the streets of the North End with a tape recorder. I got my camera. On my lunch hour, on weekends, I'm photographing them in their cold water flats, up on their roof. They got rooftop gardens. They're growing tomatoes on the garden, on the roof. They're making wine in their cellars, and I'm photographing all this stuff. And then I'm recording their stories. Because I was in, such a first name basis with it, because I was sort of like their grandson, because their kids had most of their kids had moved out now by the 70s, because they're pursuing the American dream. They're moving out to they got their college degrees. Now they want to move out to the country, outside of Boston, and they're left, they're not there anymore. So I'm kind of like, the grandson. So I start recording all their stories. And that was my first book. My first two books actually was this collection of stories that they told me. Portrait of an Italian-American neighborhood. And there's another one. And then there's another one coming out too. I'm waiting for my publisher to finish. It's going to be out soon. But these like hundreds of hours of these just table conversations. I could just I could do a home visit to someone and bring my tape recorder, sit down, have they say, hey, Antonio, you're here. I say it, sit down. You want a cup of coffee? Come on. She went on espresso. Okay, we have a little espresso. We talk. I got my tape recorder rolling. So I'd ask them, what was it like in Italy? Oh, and they start telling me, what happened in Italy, the boat ride. And that was my first book. That's what inspired me.
So they had to have an immense amount of trust in you.
They did.
To tell you these stories.
They did. They trusted me.
Yeah, that's
very much. Well, I would help them too. They knew that, if they had trouble with their landlord, or they needed legal services, or if I could help them in any way, or they just wanted to talk, I would always listen. That's just the way I was brought up.
And for you to get the stories out of them, because I know, a lot of people I interview, they tell me the same thing. And even in my family, I was probably too young to ask at the time, but they didn't talk too much about Italy. And I guess if you probed, they would tell you. But I know in both my families, they didn't really talk a lot about Italy. They concentrated more about being here.
Yes. Well, because like my grandmother, I found out later, she left Italy because she. This sounds a little crude, but she said, I got tired of peeing out in the woods. She lived in a place that had no electricity. She wouldn't eat pasta cheech because she said, I used to say to her, how come you don't like? She said, ma che la roba si mangia nei porci. That's the stuff we used to feed the pigs. So she wouldn't eat it.
She wouldn't eat it.
Because it was funny, but it wasn't, because she wanted to leave that misery, that peasantry, that hard work, that subsistence farmer world, that if you didn't raise your crops, you'd starve. That's the culture that they came from,
Yeah. And even my uncle's house, which he inherited from my great grandparents, they didn't have indoor plumbing when they left.
We always think that people came over here because because of America, they wanted a better chance. My grandmother came here for a different reason. My grandmother overthrew believe it or not, she had the nerve, the guts to overthrow 3,000 years of the patriarchal system that defined women. The reason why my grandmother left her village was because her father forbade her to marry the boy in the village she wanted to marry. So she had this standoff with my great grandfather, and she used to tell the story. She said, I asked my father, I wanted to marry this guy. He didn't want me to marry her. I packed my bags the next week and I left. That's how she ended up in New Haven.
And the interesting thing about that patriarchal society, though, yes, the fathers, they had the arranged marriages and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But the women were in charge.
You better believe it.
There's no exactly question. Right. They were in charge.
Bob, you're so right. And I'm telling you, now the book, and I keep talking about my books. I don't mean to sound like, it's about me, because it's not. I'm not trying to promote my books. But in the book, Farms, Factories, and Families, Italian-American Women of Connecticut. I ran all over the state of Connecticut and interviewed women from all the towns, elderly Italian-American women. And when I got back and wrote the book, I realized, and they told me this, these women all told me this, that they were smart enough to let the man think he was in charge.
Right.
And they would let the man, and they would never confront the man in public. because it was his show in public to show that he was in charge. They commanded not just the man, they commanded the family economy. In many cases, they made the investments in real estate. There's some great stories. I mean, I can go on and on about the stories. There was one woman who told me the story about her farming husband. They had 10 acres of land that they would farm. He was a tenant farmer. This is in Connecticut in 1920. And they had 3 children. And there was 10 acres that he would farm. And for Mr. I forgot what his name was, Mr. Stern or whatever, Mr. Scott, he was a tenant farmer. And so he would go to market once a week. And when he'd come home, he would throw all the silver, the change on the table and give it to his wife. Okay. And this went on for about a year or two. Come home, sell all his vegetables, get a cut of it, give the rest to Mr. Scott, take half for himself. And then whatever change he'd leave it to his wife. Okay. 2 years later, Mr. Scott decides he's going to sell the farm. None of the children want it. And he comes back and says to his wife, this tenant farmer, he says, Philomena, the farm is up for sale. I would love to buy it, but Mr. Scott wants $75. How can we buy this farm? We can't buy it. So they're sitting at the table. They put their kids to bed. And, he's bemoaning the fact that they don't have the money. And the wife goes in the other room. She says, Giuseppe, just sit down a minute. Aspetta un momento, aspetta. And she goes in the other room. She comes out in her bra. She takes the bra and she goes, here, she says, here's your $75. All the change you gave me all those years, here it is. Buy the farm.
Wow. That's amazing. That's incredible.
And this is the women. I mean, this is a true story. This is not made for TV, not made for Zoom. This is real stuff. And this just shows you how smart the women were. They controlled the family economy. They made the wise investments. They know how to save money. They were really, really smart. They were really smart. And they knew their place, and they let the man think he was in control. You're exactly right. Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. And they were they were the rock behind the whole family. I mean, growing up, everything revolved around my grandmother.
You better believe it.
She had 9 children. She had 23 great grandchildren. Her birthday, Mother's Day, there was no place you were going to be unless you were in her presence.
Exactly right. And that was the beauty of the old people, Bob, is that there was no currency better than your presence. They wanted nothing.
Right.
They wanted nothing. And you couldn't thank them for what they did for you. As a matter of fact, I got, people told me stories, they would buy their mother a sweater. She'd say, take it back. I don't want it. All they wanted was your presence. They just wanted you there. And that was the greatest gift you could give them. My grandparents, in the North End, just the fact that you were present and you were listening to them, that's all they wanted. They didn't want. You couldn't get them anything material to make them happy. Not the old generation. Of course, nowadays, this sounds like a fairy tale, I guess, to a lot of people, but it's true. And the only thing they wanted was not to be forgotten.
Right.
That's the only thing that they would ask you. Don't forget me. As a matter of fact, go ahead.
Well, and again, that's, people ask me, and sometimes in the family, somebody will say, why are you doing all of this? Who really cares and everything like that. And to me, that's the point of it all is I want to know who these people were, whether grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, how they lived, because in essence, that's who we are. I mean, we are who we are in America, but to your point earlier, the bravery of these people, how they lived, why they lived like that, the stamina and the love that they had for their family, all of that seems to have disappeared.
Yeah, and then there was exactly right, and that closeness that you extended to your friends, your extended family, that network you had. That was the rhythm of life, it wasn't, we measured our wealth by how many times we saw our cousins or our grandmother.
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I said this to somebody just the other day, my uncles were like parents. My nine, oh, eight, besides my mother, eight aunts and uncles on her side were like another eight parents,
Yes.
and my
Yes.
cousins were like brothers and sisters. Even now.
Even
You know.
now. Yes. It's a hard concept to get across now, Bob, because it's not like anything near like that now. It's just not. Life has changed so much, and you're right. And growing up like that, what a wonderful, what an experience growing up in that kind of a comforting, it's hard to explain. I can't. I'm filled with it. My cup is full. To be around so many loving people that were there for you, that you could, you could turn to, who would discipline you.
Oh yeah.
Who would keep you. I mean, my mother would look at me. My mother still spoke the dialect, and sometimes, she was more powerful than my she would come out with stuff in Italian that was even stronger. She said, "Guaglio, lava la faccia." Young boy, kid, keep your face clean. And that didn't mean to keep your face clean when she said lava la faccia.
Mm-hmm.
What she would say was, don't you do anything to hurt this name. Don't you do anything that would make us ashamed of you. And basically what it was is that maybe you were teetering, you were dancing near the edge there where you probably shouldn't. And she was just to remind you, that, you don't want to do anything behaviorally that's going to hurt your name.
Yeah. No,
Serious stuff.
yeah.
You growing up, you just knew what you should not do. And it was reinforced, like you said. Your uncle would tell you, your grandmother would tell you, it was just,
I remember sitting in the back of the car on the way to my grandmother's, and at least 20 times. Make sure you kiss your aunt. Make sure you kiss your grandmother. Make sure you do this. Don't say this.
Right.
Don't say it.
That's right. It was just that's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing. It's just a nice thing. It was our Southern code of behavior. It was the code. There was a code there that you and I, absorbed, and we know it.
And on the other hand, though, not so much with my father's mother. My father's father died when I was only about 2 months old, because she was more of a stately person. But with my mother's family, we weren't treated like children either. There was a certain amount of respect that you had to give and all of that. But I never remember being treated like a child.
Like a child. Right. Yes. I do. You're right. Because there was an expectation there.
Yes.
To grow up and act right. I don't know how else to say it. Just act right. And if you didn't, well, there were consequences. And that's where the whole notion of shame, the Mediterranean, there's people write books about it. It says that, there's so many books written about shame and the concept of shame in the Mediterranean world. But boy, did we, that was really something that would gnaw at you, to be ashamed of yourself. That concept, you just didn't want to go there. You don't want to do anything to make yourself ashamed of yourself. Where are we now? I mean, I don't know if I don't even hear that word used much anymore. Even, I think it would be kind of refreshing if I heard somebody say, you should be ashamed of yourself. I haven't heard that in like 20 years. Have you?
No, not at all.
That was something maybe your grandmother would have said, or your aunt or something, But that whole idea is, you just wouldn't do anything to shame yourself. You just knew.
Right. And like I said earlier, or the family. So I mean, I know you've interviewed hundreds of people, and this may be an unfair question, but maybe not.
Oh, go ahead.
What, if you were to consolidate the stories, what would be the underlying theme of what you heard from all of these people?
Well, there's so many themes. I mean, there's so many. I mean, each story is a subject. Is a theme in itself, because it's a subject, which is how I broke the books down. They're broken down in chronological order. In other words, this body of, for every book, this body of oral histories had to be separated by subject matter. Like the Spanish flu epidemic, World War One, World War Two, family life, the theme. You mean like the thread that runs through all of them?
Yeah, yeah.
I gotta say then is that I think the reason why they were telling me their stories is because they didn't want to be forgotten, because that was their way of leaving their mark on the world. Like I said, we don't descend from a culture of writing, not because we weren't, and I don't mean people that are writing novels today. Don't want to offend all our wonderful Italian American novelists, because they're, especially third generation, fourth generation, they're writing lots and lots of these novels based on, their grandparents and their past. But those people, our ancestors, didn't write their history because they couldn't. And maybe their own expression, their only way of expressing themselves was, we have to remember, our oral history tradition goes back to, the Odyssey. It goes back, you have to remember, Southern Italy was Greek. It was Magna Grecia. The whole oral tradition, the whole oral culture goes back thousands of years, if not hundreds. So that tradition of passing down our culture from father to son, mother to daughter, was known for thousands of years, and so they brought that here. They brought that here, with them, and they articulated their lives as a writer would through their stories. And I think by them telling me their stories, not only were they putting their house in order, because many of them were elders. Some of the people I interviewed were in their hundreds, 100, 101. I think the theme, if there's a theme, one general theme goes back to that idea of, don't forget me. This is who I was. This is what I went through. And I want to share it with you.
And I think that's great. And, in fact, I was just thinking about this other day. I don't know if I was watching some TV show or something like that. And I thought about that. I said, we have these histories of people that are prominent and even down to people that really don't matter that much, like, maybe a rock and roll star or a movie star or something like that. And their stories are interesting, and they've done a lot, but we don't know about the common people. And I think that's what's so exciting about what you've done, is to hear about the life of just regular, everyday, normal people and how they lived, which to me is, more fascinating than, someone who could, make 20 movies, or something like that.
I think, I appreciate that. And I think, if I may, I think when you read them, in the books, or you hear them, and like I said, we can choose a few of them. You'll be moved. You'll be moved by the simple eloquence of it. The unvarnished, unguarded table conversations where they just tell you what happened. Their own first person narratives, and they were extremely articulate. They were very moving stories. That's kind of, and of course, luckily in the books I either photographed them and included their portrait, or I used one of their family album photographs to illustrate maybe a story that they were telling me about, maybe the village or their it's that's kind of, and then I built a history. Of course, all my books they're scholarly in the sense that they're footnoted, and all my histories are written in this academic kind of scholarly way that sort of they introduce you to the oral history. So each chapter opens with an essay to give you some background before you read the stories. That's my life. So that started about my first book. So I started doing these interviews in 1979, and
wow.
And like I said, I appreciate very much you interviewing me and talking with me, because I'm not I've never really advertised myself. I've never really, this is not in me to really promote myself. As I only promote it because I think it's so important to our culture. And I'm glad you had a chance. I'm glad we had this meeting, because I think you'll find it interesting. Again, not because of me, but because of the people. that are in there.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I definitely want to do a follow-up where, if you go through,
Yeah.
some of the stories,
Yep.
we could put together another interview where we introduce, little snippets. You could talk about the people, and we could
Yeah.
put, some of the interesting bits and pieces in it. It's pretty simple to do. And yeah, we should definitely
Appreciate
do
that.
that. And I'll put some photos of the books out there for anybody who wants to find them.
Yeah.
I know they're on Amazon, and we'll
I have
get
a
this.
website.
Oh, great. Okay, good. What's the website?
Just www.anthonyriccio.com.
Okay.
www.anthonyriccio.com. Yeah, it's got all my stuff on there.
Well, that's great. Well, we'll put that out there too. Well, I really, really appreciate you taking the time. Like we said in the pre-interview, this stuff is all fascinating to me.
Yeah.
Learning the stories, listening to the stories, and that's why I started doing this.
Yeah.
Um, I'm trying to work on a book about my family. It's taking a lot longer than I thought, but I'll get there eventually. But in the meantime, this gives me the opportunity to talk to people like you and get their stories out there.
With a lot of other Italian Americans who, whose grandparents, inspired them to go back, just like me. So,
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, thanks again. I really appreciate it.
okay, Bob. Thank you.